The vibration of the grand hall's midwinter banquet rattled the loose iron hinges of my back office door. It was a low, constant tremor, the kind that spoke of heavy boots, spilled ale, and the reckless energy of the Red River Pack, celebrating a winter surplus they had not actually organized. The harvest season had been brutally unforgiving this year. 3 weeks of sudden early frost had nearly decimated the eastern grain reserves, and it was only through my desperate midnight recalculations of the internal transport schedules that we avoided a total systemic famine. I sat in the drafty annex, isolated far below the radiant heat of the main hearths, surrounded by towering stacks of delivery dockets and regional coordinate maps. These were not simple drawings. They were highly intricate grids tracking fuel consumption rates, axle weight limits, and weather delays for the heavy steam trucks crossing the treacherous northern mountains. The air in this part of the keep was always sharp with the scent of frozen stone, copper, and old tallow. I preferred it that way. Cold air kept the mind alert. It kept the ink from blurring. I ran my bare index finger along the damp edge of a newly arrived parchment slip, feeling the swollen texture of the grain. The paper was far too soft. The ambient moisture level in the lower eastern cellars had risen again. If the dampness seeped deep into the stone walls by morning, the salt-packed beef reserves would risk early rot. I pulled a charcoal pencil from behind my ear and made a precise heavy notation on the master ledger, adjusting the automated ventilation schedule for the lower larders by exactly 3 degrees. It was a small, quiet correction. Nobody dancing upstairs would ever know it happened, just as they never knew how the trade trucks navigated the frozen passes to deliver their feast on time. They did not need to know. My unseen labor was the silent architecture, holding up their loud, chaotic lives. I was Maeve Linear. They called me a clerk, a paper pusher, a background fixture with no combat prowess worth mentioning. That was fine. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. They did not need to applaud or recognize me. My survival required absolute efficiency. I stacked the final set of coordinate maps, aligning the edges perfectly against the scarred wood of my desk. The main course had been served an hour ago. It was time to deliver the verified shipping manifests for the winter trade fleet to the Alpha King. It was a strict formality, a ceremonial signature required by the old Lycan treaties before the ice permanently locked the trade ports. I gathered the heavy leather binder, blew a speck of grey dust from the cover, and stood up. The stone floor leached the warmth straight through the soles of my thin leather shoes. But I did not hurry. I moved through the narrow, unlit servant corridors with the steady, measured pace of someone who knew exactly where every blind corner lay. The service hallway abutting the grand hall was stifling, choked with the thick smell of roasted venison, spilled wine, and the heavy, musky perfumes of the pack elite. The walls here were narrow and unadorned, designed specifically to keep the logistical staff entirely out of sight while they ferried endless platters of meat to the high tables. I stood quietly in the cramped alcove behind the heavy velvet curtain, waiting for the ceremonial toast to conclude so I could step forward and present the documents. The thick, crimson fabric was supposed to insulate the Alpha's private laughter from the drafty corridors, but it failed entirely to drown out his voice. A glorified record keeper. Silas, that is all she is. Alpha King Drake's voice was unmistakable, carrying the deep, resonant timbre of a man who loved the sound of his own authority. It was the same voice that commanded armies, the same voice that had drawn me in years ago, and the same voice now echoing off the stone for his entire inner circle to hear. My boots froze against the stone. My hand hovered silently over the brass ring of the curtain pull. "The elders keep pressing the mating registry," Silas Vance replied, his tone laced with casual amusement. "They say she grounds the pack's luck. A rare logistical prodigy, they call her. A sharp, Derisive burst of laughter erupted from Drake. Luck. She is an invisible, plain Omega whose only talent is staying out of sight. A brainless paper pusher. Any schoolchild with a straight ruler and a piece of chalk could do what she does. The moment the Southern heiress arrives to finalize the new military alliance, the clerk goes right back to the dusty basement where she belongs. A sudden splash of liquid hit the other side of the velvet, accompanied by the raucous cheer of a drinking game. A second later, a single dark drip of red wine seeped through the heavy fabric. It fell directly onto the corner of the dry paper shipping manifests in my hands. I watched the crimson stain bloom slowly across the pristine parchment, a permanent and irreversible corruption of my clean data. The ink blurred instantly, twisting my precise numerical columns into illegible smears. The ruined data was only a symptom. What truly rooted my feet to the floor was the devastating clarity settling into my chest. No gasp escaped my throat. I maintained my grip on the heavy binder, refusing to push blindly through the fabric, to scream at the man who was legally bound as my fated mate. A single tear would be a waste of moisture on a man who could not comprehend my worth. I forced my jaw to unlock. Closing my eyes, I focused entirely on the freezing air drafting beneath the floorboards and breathed in deeply through my nose. I pulled my scent inward, locking down the fear so tightly that not a single heightened wolf sense in that grand room would detect a trace of distress. There was no sudden shock, no shattering of a romantic illusion. There was only the cold, heavy realization that the rumors I had ignored for months were entirely true. Drake Vane believed that brute physical force and high-born bloodlines built empires. He truly did not understand that his entire territory survived the winter exclusively because I balanced the complex ledgers he refused to read. They always said an Omega should know her place. I looked down at the ruined edge of the manifest, the red stain bleeding like a wound that refused to close. I turned my back to the velvet curtain, my footsteps completely silent against the stone. By dawn, I would show them exactly what an empty place looked like. The archive room was a cavern of cold iron and damp stone, a stark contrast to the stifling heat of the grand hall I had just left behind. As I closed the heavy oak door, the muffled sounds of the banquet, the clinking of crystal, the roar of drunken laughter, the sharp, mocking baritone of Alpha Drake Vane were finally severed. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was absolute. I stood in the dark for a moment, letting the chill of the subterranean floor seep through the thin soles of my shoes. My breathing remained perfectly even, refusing to lean against the heavy timber for support or let my hands tremble. I crossed the room to the central database mainframe, the massive mechanical heart of the Red River Pack's supply network. The brass levers and glass dials hummed with the steady flow of data, a rhythm I had memorized over 6 years of invisible labor. I reached for the primary override switch. The metal was freezing to the touch. With a steady motion, I pulled the lever down, severing my personal access to the encrypted grid. The glowing indicator lights on the console flickered, then shifted from a warm amber to a flat, unyielding red. I was logged out. The automated systems would run on my last input for a few days, coasting on the momentum of my previous calculations, before the lack of daily calibration caused the pressure valves to freeze completely. Moving away from the mainframe, I walked to the heavy wooden desk, tucked into the far corner of the room. This was my true domain. I unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out a stack of leather-bound books. These were my algorithmic journals. They were not official pack property. They were my private, charcoal-sketched notebooks containing the hand-developed logic I used to keep the automated storage silos functioning under extreme winter conditions. I ran a thumb over the worn edge of the top journal, feeling the familiar texture of the binding. Every route, every thermal vent calculation Every supply chain contingency was housed within these pages. I packed them carefully into the bottom of my single leather satchel, stacking them with the precision of a mason laying bricks. I turned my attention to the large parchment calendars pinned to the stone wall above my desk. Over the years, I had covered the margins with intricate, handwritten notes, tiny adjustments for seasonal shifts, reminders about which automated grain silos required manual venting, and warnings about the structural weaknesses in the southern transport tracks. These were the invisible bridges I had built to keep Drake's empire from collapsing. I opened the small brass tin on my desk and struck a wooden match. The sulphur flared bright and sharp in the dim room, stinging my eyes. I held the flame to the bottom corner of the first calendar. The fire caught the dry parchment instantly, curling the paper into black, fragile ash. I watched the flames eat away my careful handwriting, climbing the margins until only the official, unhelpful blank grid lines remained intact. I lit another match, and then another, moving systematically down the wall. This was not an emotional escape. It was a tactical, administrative shutdown. I extinguished the final match between my thumb and forefinger, letting the faint scent of smoke and burnt charcoal settle into the cold air. The archives were empty now. I had removed every trace of my mind from this room. The corridors of the Alpha's mansion were silent and hollow in the hour before dawn. The thick stone walls radiated a deep, biting cold that promised a harsh frost before sunrise. I moved through the empty hallways with practiced silence, my satchel secured over my shoulder, navigating the familiar geometry of the estate without needing a lantern to guide me. I bypassed the grand foyer entirely, taking the narrow servant stairwell that led directly to the private dining room. This was the room where Drake would take his morning meal in exactly 3 hours, expecting the world to run smoothly while he sat in ignorant comfort. The long mahogany table was already set for breakfast by the night staff. A single, immaculate porcelain plate sat at the head of the table, flanked by polished silver cutlery that gleamed dully in the pale moonlight filtering through the high windows. I stopped at the head of the table and unclipped the heavy, iron-rimmed pass from my belt. This was my security clearance badge. It possessed an encrypted magnetic core that authorized access to every critical infrastructure point in the territory, from the high-tensile steel grain silos to the underground thermal vents. Without it, the manual overrides were entirely useless. The metal carried a significant weight, a physical manifestation of the immense responsibility I had quietly shouldered while the rest of the pack slept. I placed the security clearance badge directly in the center of Drake's cold breakfast plate. The heavy iron made a soft, definitive clink against the fine porcelain. It was a sound that finalized everything, but leaving it there wasn't enough. I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes as I studied the orientation of the badge. The crest of the Red River pack was stamped into the iron face, a stylized wolf howling over a winding river. I reached out with a steady index finger and rotated the badge a fraction of an inch. I aligned the exact orientation of the heavy crest so that the wolf's snout pointed directly north. It was a silent, mocking directional hint, a precise final adjustment. Satisfied with the angle, I pulled my woolen cloak tighter around my shoulders, securing the leather clasp at my throat. I turned my back on the mahogany table, the porcelain plate, and the heavy iron badge. Without a backward glance at the towering stone facade of the grand hall, I walked out through the heavy oak doors of the service entrance, stepping into the freezing, snow-covered courtyard. I kept my posture straight and my footsteps measured, heading straight toward the industrial sector, where the early morning cargo train tracks lay waiting in the frost. By the time I boarded, the iron-rimmed walls of the coal freight car offered no insulation against the biting northern wind. Drafts slipped through the rusted joints of the sliding doors, carrying the scent of raw anthracite and frozen pine. I sat on a discarded wooden crate in the darkest corner, pulling the collar of my wool coat up against the chill. Through the narrow vent above me, the snow-covered outposts of the Red River Territory began to blur, dissolving into the grey winter twilight of the approaching morning. The heavy steel wheels struck the track joints with a mechanical, unrelenting cadence. Clack, clack, pause, clack, clack. I closed my eyes, pressing the pads of my gloves against my knees, matching my breathing to the rhythm of the undercarriage. 72 beats per minute, steady, methodical. I counted the metallic thumps, using the momentum to anchor my own physiology. My knuckles were stiff, white with the dropping temperature, but they did not shake. Fleeing implied panic. It implied being hunted. What I was executing was a logistical transfer of essential assets. The algorithms, the routing maps, the distribution schedules. They existed in the physical ledgers I had left behind. But the architecture of that system lived exclusively in my head. A network without its architect was merely a collection of expensive, useless metal. By crossing this border, I was not running away from a pack. I was removing the foundational pillar of an ungrateful infrastructure. Physics and friction would eventually collect their toll. The train banked sharply around a frozen ridge, the screech of steel against steel, drowning out the howl of the wind. I shifted my weight, leaning my shoulder against the vibrating wall. The cold seeped through the thick wool of my coat, settling into my skin like a familiar weight. I adjusted the strap of the satchel across my chest, feeling the solid, rectangular bulk of my private algorithmic journals inside. They were the only items of value I had brought. Clothes could be replaced. Warmth could be purchased. But the equations that governed the movement of resources were priceless. Every mile, the train carried me further north, stripped away the invisible, suffocating weight of my previous existence. I was no longer the unseen clerk in the shadow of a grand banquet hall. I was the keeper of the mathematics that kept an entire region alive. The thumping of the tracks slowed slightly as the incline steepened, signaling our approach to the high border pass. I did not look back at the fading silhouette of the territory I had maintained for 6 years. The past was an empty ledger. The future was simply a matter of proper routing. The freight train groaned to a shuddering halt in the outer yards of the Ironwood Dominion. Steam hissed from the pressure valves, billowing into the freezing air and coating the gravel platform in a thin layer of frost. I slid the heavy iron door open just enough to slip through, dropping down onto the frozen ballast. The temperature here was significantly lower than at the Red River outposts, an atmospheric freeze that made the moisture in the air crackle. I had barely taken 4 steps toward the main terminal when a harsh floodlight snapped on, pinning my shadow against a rusted container. 3 figures stepped out of the swirling snow, their heavy tactical coats trimmed in dark fur. They carried standard-issue thermal rifles, built to function in sub-zero climates without seizing. Halt. State your designation and present your transit codes. The lead guard's voice was muffled behind a thick wool scarf, but the snap of his weapon leveling at my chest was perfectly clear. Raising my hands would concede power, and surrender was a posture I refused to adopt. I stood completely still, letting the wind whip the hem of my coat. I looked past the barrel of the rifle, focusing on the guard's posture. His shoulders were hunched inward, his gloved fingers visibly trembling against the trigger guard. Behind him, the small border sentry booth was emitting a thin, pathetic trail of black smoke from its exhaust pipe, sputtering against the wind. "I have no active Ironwood transit codes," I stated evenly, keeping my voice pitched low enough that he had to lean slightly forward to hear me. "But your secondary heating manifold is failing. The black smoke indicates a complete combustion stall." The guard blinked, his rifle lowering a fraction of an inch in sheer confusion. "What did you say?" Your sentry booth, I continued, gesturing toward the small structure. The primary hearth relies on a gravity-fed coal chute, but you have the intake baffle set at a standard angle. In this atmospheric pressure, ambient condensation freezes the coal dust before it hits the ignition chamber. You are burning kindling, while the primary fuel clogs the pipe. That is why you are shivering. The second guard exchanged a wary glance with the first, stepping out of the glare. He carried a biometric scanner, his thumb hovering over the activation plate. "Who are you?" he asked, his tone shifting to cautious. "Someone who knows how to fix your intake valve," I answered, meeting his gaze. "If you allow me access to the booth, I can adjust the baffle clearance. It will restore thermal output within 4 minutes. After that, you can escort me to the regional administrator to formalize my asylum request." Silence stretched between us, broken only by the hiss of the cooling locomotive. The lead guard looked at his freezing hands, then back at the black smoke rising from his station. Abandoning the interrogation, he lowered the rifle completely, gesturing with a stiff nod toward the sentry booth. The coldest border in the north was not breached by force, but by the practical application of basic thermodynamics. The heavy oak doors of the sovereign's study closed with a solid thud, shutting out the industrial hum of the Ironwood Dominion's inner keep. The temperature inside was a stark contrast to the freezing train yard I had just navigated. Here, the air was warm, heavy with the scent of burning cedar and the pragmatic tang of cold steel. I stood near the massive mahogany desk, keeping my posture straight and my breathing carefully measured. My survival depended on the next few minutes. Sovereign King Matthew Ironwood did not sit on an elevated throne. He stood alone by the frost-rimmed windows, quietly reviewing maritime shipping reports in the dying light. He occupied the room differently than any alpha I had ever known. Matthew Ironwood occupied silence the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. When his dark eyes flicked over my ash-stained travel cloak, he did not know he was looking at the unseen architect of his rival's entire logistical framework. I stepped forward, placing my satchel on the edge of his desk. My movements were deliberate, practiced in the shadows of drafty archives. I unbuckled the straps and withdrew my algorithmic journals, setting them on the polished wood. In a flat voice, I explained exactly who I was and what I had built for Drake's territory. I detailed the encrypted distribution networks and the thermal vent systems that the Red River borders fed, while the rest of the north struggled against the ice. Matthew walked slowly over to the desk, simply opening the top journal. His gaze swept over the complex mathematical models and the pages of densely written code that dictated the survival of thousands. I watched his expression shift from polite skepticism to profound, silent shock. He had expected the logistical mastermind of the Red River to be a seasoned guild engineer, not a freezing young woman standing alone in his study. My composure remained absolute, a practiced mask forged in the drafty archives, as I waited for him to dismiss me. But Matthew did not interrogate me. His eyes dropped to my hands. My knuckles were white, but worse. My fingers were heavily stained with dark ledger ink ground in with the gritty black coal dust from the freight train. It was the undeniable physical mark of grueling labor. In Drake's grand hall, I would have hidden them behind my back in shame. Rather than ringing for a servant or offering empty platitudes, he pulled a pristine square of white linen from his drawer and held it out to me. He was not wiping my hands for me. He was simply providing the tool I needed to clean myself. I took the linen from his outstretched hand. The fabric was soft, warm from the ambient heat of the hearth. As I rubbed the harsh coal dust from my ink-stained skin, a terrifying knot in my chest began to loosen. He had not looked at my stained hands with the disgust of an elite alpha. He had looked at them with absolute, undeniable respect, Once the grime was gone, I set the soiled linen aside. Matthew pulled a stack of official parchment from a leather folio and dipped a steel-nibbed quill into a heavy glass inkwell. The sharp scratching sound of the pen became the only noise in the study. He was drawing up the formal documentation for my asylum himself, bypassing weeks of bureaucratic delays with a few decisive strokes of his signature. "You are granted temporary security clearance effective immediately," Matthew said, sprinkling a pinch of fine sand over the wet ink. "It will become permanent as soon as my administrative council files the ledger entry at dawn tomorrow." He handed me the heavy parchment. The dark red wax seal at the bottom was still warm to the touch. I traced the edge of the document, letting the reality of my legal freedom settle into my bones. It was a legally binding contract, recorded in ink and witnessed by the sovereign himself. "Your office is on the second floor of the Eastern Administrative Wing," Matthew continued, placing a heavy brass key beside my algorithmic journals. "It overlooks the northern supply warehouses, so you can visually verify the physical movement of the cargo you are routing. It has a dedicated hearth, reinforced iron locks, and an unshared terminal linked directly to our primary logistics mainframe." I looked down at the brass key. In the Red River territory, my workspace had been a freezing, forgotten archive room subject to random, arrogant inspections by Silas Vance. They had routinely barged in without knocking, spilling cheap ale on my territorial maps. The idea of having a secure, warm room of my own felt luxurious. "Sovereign," I started, my voice quiet but unyielding. "The routing algorithms I design require uninterrupted processing. If your generals attempt to manually override the supply grid, the entire distribution network will stall." Matthew met my gaze, his expression remaining completely serious. He did not bristle at my condition or demand my blind obedience. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his large hands flat on the mahogany desk, establishing a geometry of absolute equality between us. "No wolf from my territory will monitor your terminal, Maeve," Matthew promised, the words carrying the heavy weight of an official decree. "You have complete creative and operational control over your algorithms. If a general has a problem with your routing, they will bring their complaints to me, and I will tell them to wait." I reached out and picked up the brass key. He was granting me intellectual independence. Tomorrow, I would begin rewriting the Ironwood Dominion's struggling supply lines, but tonight, for the first time in 6 long years, I would walk into a warm room, close a heavy oak door behind me, lock it, and know that absolutely no one would dare to turn the handle without my permission. The Ironwood Dominion's primary maritime warehouse was a cathedral of freezing shadows and disorganized cargo. I stood just inside the massive iron-reinforced doors, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the frost-webbed skylights. The air here was bitter, biting aggressively through the heavy wool coat Matthew had provided, carrying the distinct, heavy scents of salted beef, cold tallow, and damp pine timber. It was a smell of survival, but also of systemic stagnation. A dozen dockworkers and thick-necked quartermasters paused their heavy lifting to stare at me. They were massive, broad-shouldered men, with frost clinging to their beards, accustomed to taking orders from loud military commanders. There was no need to raise my voice or offer a grand speech about my new title as Director of Maritime Commerce and Logistics. Instead, I pulled a wooden measuring ruler and a charcoal pencil from my pocket, walking past them toward the towering stacks of supply barrels lining the eastern wall. The cold was not just a weather condition, it was systemic. It had seeped into the very architecture of the storage facility. I stopped before a row of oak water barrels, pulling off my right leather glove. My knuckles were pale, stiff from the northern chill, but my hands remained steady. I tapped the wooden ruler against the side of the nearest barrel. The sound was flat, dull, entirely devoid of the hollow resonance that liquid should produce. It was solid ice. I knelt on the freezing stone floor, pressing the flat edge of the ruler against the metal banding of the lower barrel. I measured the exact thickness of the frost accumulation on the iron hoops, scoring the number onto a piece of rough parchment. 2 inches of external rime meant the ambient temperature had dropped below the survival threshold for grain preservation nearly 3 days ago. I moved to the next row, repeating the process without looking at the men watching me. Tap, measure, record. I calculated the thermal delay in my head. The warehouses were built too far from the city's industrial heat, relying on passive insulation that failed entirely against the Dominion's brutal coastal winds. The quartermasters watched in uneasy silence as I moved methodically through the aisles, touching the damp pine crates of salted beef and inspecting the hardened lumps of cold tallow. They expected me to yell about their inefficiency. They did not expect me to map the exact atmospheric pressure of their failure. The layout was a logistical nightmare. Heavy raw materials were stacked directly in front of perishable goods, blocking the narrow loading aisles and creating severe transit bottlenecks. Every time a ship needed coal, the workers had to move 10 tons of structural timber first. It was a system built on brute physical strength rather than intelligent design. I stopped at the center of the warehouse, sliding my charcoal pencil behind my ear. I did not need to ask the foreman why the canals were frozen. I could read the trajectory of the dying heat in the frost patterns spreading across the stone floor. The solution was not to fight the cold with muscle. The solution was to redirect the warmth that already existed. Back in my warm, lamplit office, overlooking the frozen harbor, I spread a massive canvas map of the Ironwood Dominion across the wide oak drafting table. The room was quiet, heated by a steady coal fire in the corner hearth, but my focus remained entirely on the paralyzed logistics network laid out before me. Matthew Ironwood stood on the opposite side of the table, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He did not hover. He did not interrupt. He possessed the rare ability to observe a working mind without the arrogant impulse to direct it. I pulled a brass wax melter toward the center of the map, lighting the small wick beneath the melting spoon. I had requested 3 sticks of sealing wax, red, blue, and black, and Matthew had provided them immediately, without questioning my methods. "Your current shipping flow is fighting the geography of your own territory," I said, my voice low and even as I dropped a chunk of black wax into the hot spoon. "Your quartermasters are pushing heavy coal barge down the central canal, but the water freezes faster than the iron-hulled icebreakers can clear it. The manual labor required to shatter the harbor locks is costing you 30% of your daily daylight." I poured a single drop of melted black wax onto the parchment map, right at the intersection of the main harbor locks. I pressed a flat brass stamp into it, leaving a hard, dark circle. "That is your primary transit bottleneck." Matthew looked down at the black seal. He did not argue or defend his general's outdated strategies. "What is the alternative?" I cleaned the spoon with a scrap of linen and dropped in a piece of red wax. The city's ironworks and smelting foundries are located on the western ridge. They produce massive amounts of ambient thermal exhaust, which is currently being vented straight up into the open winter sky. The red wax liquefied, bubbling slightly against the heated brass. I lifted the spoon and began to drip a careful, connecting line of red dots from the western ridge down toward the harbor locks. If we lay a network of subsurface copper piping, my custom thermal vent algorithm calculates a required diameter of exactly 8 inches. We can capture that exhaust. We route the industrial steam directly under the stone embankments of the shipping canals. I placed a final, solid drop of red wax directly over the black seal at the harbor. The ambient heat from the foundries will continuously warm the canal water from below. The locks will not freeze. Your coal barges will move unobstructed through open water, and the icebreakers can be reassigned to deep-water escort duty. Matthew studied the red path across the canvas. His gaze tracked the logic, tracing the mathematical precision of the thermal route. There was no dismissal in his eyes, no assumption that an Omega could not understand heavy infrastructure. There was only a profound, quiet recognition of a problem solved. It requires restructuring the entire Western transit grid. Matthew noted, his voice a steady, pragmatic rumble that did not betray doubt, only calculation. "I have already drafted the operational flowcharts," I replied, pulling a thick stack of my algorithmic journals from the edge of the desk. I opened the first leather-bound book, revealing pages of dense, calculated diagrams, material costs, and pressure metrics. The transition will take exactly 48 hours. The foundries will not need to halt production during the pipe installation, provided your welders follow these specific schematics. Matthew looked from the complex algorithmic journals back to the colored wax seals on the map, and finally to me. The amber firelight caught the sharp angles of his face, illuminating the absolute seriousness in his expression. He did not lean into my space, nor did he offer unearned praise. "Executed it," Matthew said simply. Bypassing the need for a council vote or redundant proof, he recognized the undeniable weight of concrete evidence, and with 3 words, he gave me the power to rebuild his world. The iron lever of the primary control valve was freezing to the touch, biting through the thin leather of my gloves as I pushed it forward with both hands. Beneath the reinforced metal grating of the harbor docks, the newly aligned thermal vent networks groaned like a sleeping beast slowly waking. For a long, tense minute, there was nothing but the steady hum of pressure building within the iron pipes. The gathered warehouse workers, a dozen broad-shouldered men with calloused hands and faces streaked with coal dust, stood in heavy silence, watching the ice-choked surface of the central supply canal. I kept my posture straight, eyes locked on the brass pressure gauge mounted to the stone wall, calculating the exact second the steam would equalize. Then came the sound. It started as a low structural crack, shivering up through the soles of my boots and echoing against the cold brick. A massive slab of blue-white ice near the primary dock splintered straight down the middle. Hot water, redirected from the Dominion's subterranean boilers through the precise routing I had designed the night before, surged up into the freezing waterway. The thick frost that had paralyzed the ironwood trade routes for 3 weeks began to dissolve into rising clouds of grey steam. The scent of melting ice, wet timber, and sharp ozone filled the frigid northern air. A slow, quiet knot of tension unspooled in my chest, though my expression remained composed. The canal was open. The cargo barges, laden with vital fuel and grain, bobbed gently as the heavy ice floes broke apart and drifted downstream toward the outer locks. A cheer erupted from the dock workers, a rough, guttural sound of pure relief that cut through the winter wind. They did not look at me with the dismissive indifference of the Red River Guards or the polite contempt of high-born courtiers. They looked at me as the person who had just given them back their livelihood. A towering cargo foreman, his beard thick with melting frost and his heavy coat patched at the elbows, stepped forward. He hesitated, looking down at his massive, scarred hands, before pulling a thick, knitted woolen scarf from his own neck. He held it out to me without a word. The fabric was a deep, practical grey, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old pine and honest labour. I took it with a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement, looping the coarse wool around my collar. It was rough against my skin, far from the fine, suffocating velvet of the grand hall, but it carried a weight of genuine respect that no royal title could command. I adjusted the ends of the scarf, letting the coarse material settle securely over my shoulders against the damp chill. From that moment on, I decided this would be my uniform. I would wear the gratitude of the working docks over any embroidered silk, the Southern Territories had to offer. The heavy oak door to my new office opened with barely a whisper of hinges, the sound swallowed by the thick stone walls of the administrative wing. I did not look up immediately from the wide mahogany desk, my ink-stained fingers tracing the charcoal sketches of my algorithmic journals beside the freshly tallied harbor manifests. The numbers were undeniable. The thermal vent operation had triggered a cascading effect across the entire logistical grid, resulting in a 60% surge in coal distribution before the sun had even reached its peak. The Dominion's supply lines were breathing again, their frozen arteries cleared by mathematics and pressure. I set my quill down only when the scent of dark roasted chicory and wild mint drifted across the parchment. Matthew Ironwood moved into the room with that characteristic, unhurried grace, occupying the space without the arrogant noise most sovereign leaders required to feel important. He carried 2 heavy ceramic mugs, steam curling up from their rims in the dim golden light of the brass desk lamp. He placed one near my elbow, careful not to disturb the stacked ledgers, before taking a seat in the leather chair opposite the desk. Instead of demanding a status report, he simply studied the open pages, his dark eyes sharp and observant, reading the finalized calculations upside down with effortless precision. The quiet warmth of the room pressed against the frosted window panes, a stark sensory contrast to the bitter wind howling outside the keep. I wrapped my hands around the hot ceramic, letting the heat seep into my chilled joints. The drink was strong, bitter, and exactly what I needed to clear the lingering exhaustion of a sleepless night. Matthew leaned back in his chair, watching me take a slow sip. He did not offer empty praise, nor did he make any dramatic declarations about my worth. Instead, he reached into his heavy wool coat and pulled out 3 folded dispatch letters, setting them quietly on the edge of my desk. They were field reports from the furthest northern outposts, places where the winter wind was most lethal. Matthew handed them to me, his voice a low rumble. The roots hold. They survive because of you. The words settled between us, heavy, factual, and absolute. He was not speaking to me as a subordinate who had performed a task well, nor as a fragile omega needing validation. The quiet respect in his tone was the kind reserved for an equal partner in governance, a fellow architect of the Dominion's survival. He saw the exact weight of my labor, recognized its structural worth, and chose to sit across from me in the quiet aftermath to share the burden of that success. I looked down at the steaming mug, the grey woolen scarf still wrapped securely around my neck, and realized that for the first time in 6 years, I did not have to make myself small to fit inside a room. Miles away, the wind cutting through the central courtyard of the Red River Pack's prime storage facility was sharp enough to draw blood. The towering winter grain silos, constructed of thick, high-tensile steel, loomed against the grey morning sky like silent frozen monuments. Frost had already begun to creep up the reinforced support struts, encasing the automated loading bays in white ice. For generations, the pack had relied on raw physical strength to secure their borders, but all the muscle in the territory was currently standing helpless in front of a digital terminal. Silas Vance paced before the main access console, his combat boots crunching against the ice. The military general solved problems with volume and violence, but neither was proving effective against a locked interface. His broad shoulders were tense under his heavy fur-lined coat, his jaw clenched so tightly the muscles twitched. Standing a few paces behind him, leaning on a carved wooden cane, was Charles. The elderly and gruff archive keeper had been sent from the Ironwood Dominion to audit the scheduled winter grain transfers, a diplomatic formality that had suddenly turned into a logistical nightmare. Charles watched the general's frantic movements with a look of dry disdain. He respected absolute administrative precision, and what he was witnessing was the exact opposite. just bypassed the primary relay, Silas barked at a trembling junior logistics manager who was desperately leafing through a stack of outdated manuals. "Break the glass. Pull the lever. Do whatever you have to do. The outposts need their shipments by noon, or they freeze." "We cannot, sir," the young manager stammered, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "The manual levers are electronically tethered to the main grid. If we force them, the internal pressure seals will lock down permanently." Silas snarled, shoving the young man aside. He stepped up to the terminal, peeling off his thick leather glove. He slammed his heavy fingers against the glass keypad, punching in a rapid sequence of random numerical overrides that had worked years ago. He hit the enter key with enough force to crack the protective casing. The machine did not yield. Instead, the soft blue glow of the digital interface flickered, shifting instantly to a harsh, blinding crimson. A high-pitched electronic tone pierced the cold air. On the center of the screen, a red countdown timer materialized, ticking backward from 60 minutes. Beneath the numbers, a line of crisp, elegant text appeared, written in the unmistakable logistical syntax I had perfected. Charles adjusted his spectacles, a faint, grim smile touching his lips. It was a masterpiece of systemic defense. Silas stared at the blinking red numbers, his chest heaving with exertion. Muscle and claws meant absolutely nothing against a meticulously programmed lockout. The pack's entire survival was trapped behind a wall of logic that none of them knew how to climb. 10 minutes later, the heavy iron gates of the storage courtyard swung open, and Drake marched into the freezing enclosure. The Alpha King was flanked by 4 elite guards, his usual aura of unshakable dominance visibly fraying around the edges. He wore a heavy sable cloak over his formal banquet attire, having been pulled directly from a morning strategy meeting. His boots struck the icy pavement with aggressive thuds, his eyes locked on the glowing red interface of the main terminal. "What is the meaning of this delay?" Drake demanded, his voice a low rumble that echoed off the frozen steel walls. He glared at the shivering logistics crew, ignoring the diplomatic presence of Charles. "I gave explicit orders for the northern transport lines to be loaded before dawn. Why are the silos still sealed?" Silas stepped back from the console, his posture rigid. "We are locked out, Alpha," the general admitted, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "The entire automated distribution grid has been encrypted. The system is operating on a localized countdown loop." "That is impossible," Drake snapped, waving away the excuses. He refused to believe that his own territory could be withheld from him. To an Alpha King, the world was a hierarchy of submission, and machines were expected to obey just as blindly as his soldiers. The grid is designed to recognize royal clearance. Step aside. Drake strode up to the primary terminal, his jaw set in a hard line. Ignoring the warning text and the blinking red numbers, he slammed his bare right hand flat against the master biometric sensor, expecting the heavy steel doors to groan open in immediate compliance. The scanner flashed a bright white light across his palm. For a single breathless second, the courtyard was completely silent, save for the howling of the winter wind. Then the console let out a soft, polite chime. The screen shifted. A new dialogue box expanded across the center of the display, overriding the countdown timer. The text was rendered in a clean, elegant font, projecting a calm neutrality that felt almost mocking in its precision. Error. Access denied. Administrative permissions for user. Drake Vane have been permanently revoked by the chief manager of logistics. Drake stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. His knuckles turned stark white against the cold glass. He pressed his palm down harder, applying his full body weight to force the machine to recognize his inherent authority. Error. Access denied. Administrative permissions revoked. The pre-recorded text prompt flashed again, perfectly indifferent to his rank. Drake let out a guttural sound of pure rage, striking the reinforced casing with a closed fist. The impact bruised his skin and rattled the metal housing, but the screen remained intact, blinking its calm red denial. His explosive anger battered uselessly against the silent logic of the system. The most powerful man in the Red River Pack was being humiliated by a line of code. He stood freezing before the terminal, grasping at last that the plain Omega he had discarded held the only keys to his kingdom. I did not need to stand in the frozen courtyard of the Red River Pack to witness what happened next. The architecture of the primary winter grain silos was entirely my own design, and physics required no audience to execute its laws. Matthew's border scouts would eventually intercept the frantic radio transmissions, and the elderly archive keeper, Charles Thorne, would later provide me with the precise, miserable details of that morning. Alpha King Drake Vane, having exhausted his patience with locked keypads, reverted to the only language his hierarchy understood. He ordered his vanguard warriors to retrieve the heavy pneumatic rams and carbon-tipped mining drills from the deep quarries. They dragged the massive industrial equipment across the frosted cobblestones, the iron treads carving deep scars into the pristine courtyard I had meticulously paved 3 summers prior. Drake stood wrapped in his thick ceremonial furs, his breath plumbing in the freezing air, demanding the men simply shatter the high tensile steel doors. The warriors revved the heavy drills, the roaring engines echoing off the stone walls, masking the subtle, high-pitched hum of the internal pressure sensors waking up inside the silo walls. They threw their combined lichen strength against the pneumatic rams, slamming the heavy iron heads against the reinforced seams of the grain locks. The metal shrieked. Sparks showered over the snow, smelling sharply of ozone and burnt iron. As the carbon drill tip finally bit into the outer steel casing and ground its way through the first layer of alloy, Drake must have believed that physical dominance had won. He must have smiled, thinking no mechanism could withstand the raw power of a wolf pack's fury. He was wrong. The moment the drill tip pierced the secondary pressure membrane, it triggered the fail-safe protocols I had hard-coded into the structural foundations. The system registered a hostile thermal breach. The automated safety relief valves, hidden deep within the concrete housing, snapped open simultaneously. There was no grand explosion for his warriors to heroically dodge, only a sharp mechanical hiss. In less than 3 seconds, the internal pipelines flushed a massive payload of liquid nitrogen directly into the primary locking mechanisms and the vestibule corridors. The temperature around the silo doors plummeted instantly. The heavy pneumatic rams froze mid-strike, their hydraulic fluids turning to solid ice, cracking the steel pistons wide open. The warriors scrambled backward, dropping their drills as the handles became cold enough to strip the skin directly from their palms. A thick, rolling cloud of sub-zero vapor spilled out across the courtyard, encasing the shattered entry points in an impenetrable block of glacial frost. The brute force of the Red River Pack had not conquered the silos. It had permanently entombed them, with the primary grain and coal reserves completely locked down by the nitrogen flood. The logistical paralysis of the territory shifted from an inconvenience to a terminal crisis. The localized freeze expanded, sealing the underground distribution valves that fed the outer perimeters. Within hours, the fuel supply lines running to the northern border outposts simply dried up. The massive steam-powered generators keeping the sentry towers warm went silent, their copper pipes groaning as the residual heat vanished into the bitter winter air. The generals who had spent the last decade mocking the quiet clerks who calculated their coal rations now found themselves pacing through the drafty corridors of the Grand Hall, pulling their heavy cloaks tighter as the ambient temperature inside the keep began to drop. I knew exactly how Charles must have looked as he walked into the central strategy room that evening. The archivist possessed no physical strength to boast of, but he carried the one weapon his alpha could no longer fight. Charles spread the territory's master thermal map across the heavy oak table, smoothing the curled edges with his ink-stained fingers. The parchment was overlaid with a grid of chemically treated, heat-sensitive nodes, designed to track the live fuel consumption of every outpost under their banner. It was a system I had built to ensure no pack member ever slept in the cold. Now, it was a dying grid. The heat signatures were winking out one by one, like embers scattered across a freezing stone hearth. The decline of their mighty empire was being measured in Celsius, charted in the exact mathematical increments I had mapped out for them. The elderly man looked up from the fading grid, meeting the Alpha King's desperate gaze. The pack was freezing to death, and no amount of roaring could ignite a fire from an empty ledger. Retreating from the strategy room, Alpha King Drake Vane descended into the underground archive beneath the Grand Hall. It smelled of stagnant air, decaying paper, and the bitter dust of neglected history. He had never stepped foot in this windowless sub-basement. Down here there was no glory. There were only rows of towering, slate-grey filing cabinets, heavy wooden crates, and miles of catalogued ledgers, documenting the invisible mechanics of his pack's survival. Now, with the automated silos permanently locked, this miserable cellar was his absolute last hope. Drake moved frantically down the narrow aisles, kicking aside empty wooden crates that clattered loudly against the uneven stone floor. He desperately required an override sequence, a master key, a written contingency plan, anything to bypass the algorithmic lockout. He yanked open drawer after drawer of the nearest metal cabinets. Folders spilled onto the cold stone, scattering hundreds of meticulously dated cargo manifests, maintenance schedules, and transit logs. Every single page bore my precise, perfectly spaced handwriting. The sheer volume of my administrative labor mocked his uncoordinated search. Where he operated on brute force and loud commands, I had built an empire of quiet, undeniable order. He had laughed at my lack of physical prowess behind a heavy velvet curtain. Now he was tearing through my abandoned domain like a starving scavenger in the dark. "Where is the override?" He snarled, slamming a heavy steel drawer shut with his shoulder. The metallic boom answered him with absolute, suffocating silence. He reached blindly for the handle of the next cabinet, yanking it outward with entirely too much uncontrolled force. The rusted track jammed halfway, and the sharp, unpolished edge of the steel drawer sliced deeply across his palm. Drake hissed a curse, pulling his hand back. A thick line of crimson bloomed across his skin, warm and shocking in the freezing air. He stood trembling in the dim light of a single flickering overhead bulb, his chest heaving as the sharp, metallic scent of his own blood mixed with the dry smell of old parchment. A heavy drop fell from his knuckles, landing with a soft tap against a stack of forgotten, yellowed papers on a lower shelf. As he reached down to wipe away the blood, his gaze locked onto an anomalous item sitting just beneath the stained pages. It was a thick envelope wrapped in dark leather, sealed with a cracked, crimson wax stamp bearing the unmistakable crest of the pack's lineage records. Written across the front in the faded script of the old pack elders was a single name, Maeve Linnea. Drake stared at the heavy leather envelope, his bleeding hand momentarily forgotten. The pack's lineage records were strictly guarded, catalogued by the Elder Council to track the bloodlines of the most powerful wolves. A mundane clerk who managed shipping routes had no business possessing a wax-stamped file from the High Registry. His pulse hammered a heavy, irregular rhythm against his throat. With shaking fingers, he ignored the blood smearing across the dark leather and cracked the ancient crimson seal. The wax crumbled into fine red dust, scattering over the floor. He pulled out the thick vellum document tucked inside. It was a formal birth registry, authenticated by the signatures of 3 previous Alpha Kings. Drake scanned the heavy black ink, his eyes darting across the dates, the bloodline markers, and the astrological alignments recorded at the hour of my birth. Then he reached the final indisputable line of the registry. The document classified me not as a low-ranking worker, but as a carrier of the rare sovereign anchor bloodline, recording my biological resonance. I was his destined, fated mate. The realization struck with the physical force of a collapsing wall. The paper trembled in his bloody grip. For 6 years, he had credited his reign's unprecedented prosperity. The flawless trade routes, the overflowing grain silos, the absence of border famine, to his own brilliant leadership and military intimidation. He had believed the whispers of his generals, claiming the Red River Pack was simply blessed by the moon. But the truth was written right here in undeniable ink. His luck, his stability, and the invisible magic keeping his territory thriving had emanated entirely from the quiet woman balancing his ledgers. He had thrown away the most valuable asset his territory had ever possessed to satisfy his own superficial vanity. The freezing outposts and locked silos were not a mechanical glitch. They were the natural, catastrophic consequence of severing a sovereign anchor bond. The cold stone of the archive seemed to close in on him as the flickering bulb above finally burned out. Drake fell to his knees in the darkness, the bloody registry clutched to his chest. 2 weeks after my departure, I stood beside the drafting table in the Ironwood Logistics compound, tracing new coal distribution routes with a charcoal pencil. The room smelled of pine oil and the dry heat of the iron radiator. Matthew stood near the oak door. His posture was, as always, unhurried. He held a piece of wax-sealed parchment delivered by a frantic rider, wearing the crimson livery of the Red River Pack. The silence in the office was comfortable, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Matthew broke the seal, dropping small shards of brittle red wax onto the floorboards like dried blood. He unfolded the heavy paper, his eyes moving over the ink, with the steady calculation of a man assessing a damaged shipment. He read Drake's threats regarding the main routes and the deployment of his armed vanguard across the neutral zone. The words were meant to conjure images of infantry marching through the snow of locked borders and political ruin. I felt the particular kind of pain that comes not from surprise, but from confirmation. His message held no plea for my return, only a demand for the retrieval of an asset. Matthew lowered the parchment. He simply waited, allowing me the first move. I set the pencil down, walking over to the far wall where a massive reproduction of the Grand Lichen Charter hung beneath a brass light. Section 4, Article 9, I said quietly, tapping the glass over the dense block of legal text. Matthew stepped closer. A territory claiming a trade blockade over a neutral zone must prove exclusive sovereignty over the contested goods. I recited, my voice entirely steady. If the goods rely on shared maritime canals, any unilateral blockade is legally classified as piracy under the High Council's jurisdiction. I turned to the Sovereign King. If Drake moves a single armed unit into the neutral zone, he automatically forfeits his trading charter. He is not threatening war. He is threatening his own economic suicide. Matthew studied the text behind the glass. A faint, pragmatic shadow of a smile touched his mouth. A sovereign who does not know the law, he murmured, is just a thug with a crown. He tossed the threatening letter onto the burning logs in the hearth, and we watched the paper curl, blacken, and turn to ash. The storm broke over the northern border checkpoint just before dusk, driving sheets of grey sleet against the reinforced glass of the toll office. I stood inside the elevated observation deck, the ambient heat from the copper pipes warming the air. Below the heavy windows, the steel barricades of the Ironwood Dominion were locked firmly in place. Through the swirling snow, A convoy of off-road vehicles ground to a halt. The engines idled aggressively, spitting thick plumes of diesel exhaust into the freezing wind. Drake stepped out of the lead vehicle. Even from this height, I recognized the rigid, furious set of his shoulders. He wore no coat, relying on raw biology to withstand the biting sleet, a performative display of dominance that meant nothing to the steel blocking his path. He was flanked by 6 guards, their hands hovering near their tactical belts, looking entirely out of place in a territory that operated on mechanics and law, rather than brute intimidation. Matthew stood beside me in the observation deck. He wore a dark wool overcoat, his hands resting casually in his pockets, watching the display below with the clinical detachment of a man observing a failing mechanism. He kept his own guards at ease. Drake stalked up to the primary communication terminal mounted on the toll booth. He hit the call button with enough force to crack the plastic housing. The audio relayed through the speaker above my head, distorted and crackling. Ironwood. Drake's voice boomed through the small room, thick with the ragged edge of a man who had not slept. I know she is here. You have 3 minutes to open these gates and hand over my property, or my men will tear this checkpoint apart. He looked up, his eyes scanning the tinted glass of the observation deck, drawn instinctively to where I stood. I looked down at him the way one examines a ledger entry that no longer balances, stripped of fear or the residual ache of a rejected mate. He was demanding the return of a woman he had publicly mocked, using the language of ownership because he lacked the vocabulary for respect. Matthew glanced at me. Do you want to speak to him? No, I answered. The word was a simple statement of fact. There was nothing left to say. I remained behind the structural barrier of my new life, warm, safe, and entirely out of his reach. I watched the snow accumulate on his shoulders. He opened his mouth to shout again, but the heavy glass swallowed the sound, rendering his fury completely silent. Matthew reached forward and pressed the control button on the desk. A recorded, automated voice echoed out to the checkpoint below. Aside access denied. Please submit all trade grievances to the High Council in the city of Spires. Drake slammed his fist against the steel barricade, but the metal did not yield. I turned away from the window, leaving him standing in the cold, and walked back to my desk to finish the evening accounts. By the 3rd week, those grievances brought us before the tribunal. The High Council chambers in the neutral city of Spires smelled of beeswax, ancient vellum, and the sharp bite of polished limestone. It was not a room built for the feral displays of pack dominance that governed the northern territories. The ceiling vaulted high above us, trapping the cold draft that rolled off the tall windows, while the massive semicircular table of the tribunal was carved from solid black ironwood. Sitting beside Matthew at the defendant's desk, I kept my hands folded quietly. My breathing was slow and measured, matching the deliberate tick of the grand clock. Across the patterned floor, Drake paced like a caged beast, his heavy boots echoing sharply against the stone. He had brought his finest warriors to intimidate the assembly, but in this room, their swords and sheer muscle meant nothing. Eldon Croft sat at the center of the dais, his robes immaculate, his expression carved from the same unyielding stone as the walls. The head counselor regarded the snarling alpha with the profound boredom of a man who dealt in numbers, not fangs. When my former mate slammed his fist against the wooden railing, demanding his stolen property and trade rights be restored under the old blood laws, the elderly official did not flinch. The echo of the blow died awkwardly in the cavernous space. Eldon picked up his wooden mallet and brought it down against a brass striking block. The sharp crack cut through the rising tirade, forcing an abrupt silence upon the room. The presiding judge adjusted his spectacles, looking down his nose at the pacing man below. He stated, with a voice as dry as winter kindling, that the High Trade Council ruled on commerce, logistics, and documented fact, not on emotional grievances or pack pride. If the rival territory wished to accuse Matthew of an unprovoked blockade, they needed to provide verifiable shipping manifests, audited transit logs, and mathematical proof of their losses. The mallet tapped the brass one more time, demanding that the complaining party either present factual evidence or concede the floor. Drake's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering furiously beneath his ear. He had no ledgers to offer. His managers were locked out of the very silos they claimed to own, and the basement archives he relied upon were a chaotic mess of unsorted paper. He stood there, vibrating with useless rage, expecting the sheer weight of his rank to bend the rules of the city. Matthew, sitting perfectly still beside me, simply turned a page in his flawlessly organized binder, occupying his chair with the quiet certainty of a sovereign who knew the true war was already won on paper. When the head counselor called the representative for the Ironwood Dominion to the witness podium, I stood up. The ambient noise in the chamber shifted, thickening as the assembly realized that the sovereign king was not speaking for himself. I walked down the short flight of steps, the soft rustle of my heavy woolen skirt the only sound in the vast hall. In my arms, I carried the charter tax registers I had spent the past week auditing. They were thick, imposing volumes bound in cracked leather, smelling of dried ink and damp cellar air. I set them down on the wooden podium with a dull, heavy thud. From his place across the room, the arrogant Alpha let out a low, derisive scoff, muttering to his guards about bringing a lowly clerk to fight a sovereign's battle. He clearly expected me to wither under the combined stares of the most powerful elders. Ignoring him entirely, I unclasped the brass lock on the first volume, the cold metal biting pleasantly into my thumb. I smoothed the thick parchment flat, letting my eyes track the columns of numbers I knew by heart. Addressing Eldon directly, I stated my name and my newly minted title as High Director of Logistics. Then, speaking with the cadence of a metronome, clear and entirely level, I began to read. I read the exact dates of unauthorized border crossings. I cited specific ship registry numbers from neutral merchants who had been forced to surrender 40% of their cargo to pass through the southern waterways. I detailed the exorbitant fees extorted under the guise of security tariffs, a direct violation of the Grand Lichen Charter. As the data filled the cold air, the atmosphere in the room fundamentally changed. The elders leaned forward, their quills scratching furiously against their own parchment as they cross-referenced my testimony. The arithmetic was flawless, leaving no space for a feral roar to distort the truth. Delivering the strict arithmetic of his ruin, I turned page after page, my finger tracing the physical proof of a corrupt system that had relied entirely on intimidation. When I finally closed the last book, the sharp snap of the leather cover echoed like a guillotine blade dropping. The chamber sat in stunned silence. The man who had once mocked my invisible labor now stared at the locked registers, finally understanding that the silent paper pusher he had discarded was the only person keeping his empire from collapsing into dust. Eldon Croft broke the silence. The head counselor, focused only on the charter tax registers, spread beneath his iron-rimmed spectacles, his ink-stained fingers carefully tracing the dense columns of numbers. The quiet in the vast stone hall was absolute again, broken only by the sharp, rhythmic scratch of his quill, transferring figures onto the official writ of censorship. Matthew stood beside me in the witness gallery, his presence a quiet, immovable anchor. Drake stood in the center of the floor, the muscles in his jaw ticking as the reality of the bureaucratic machinery finally closed around him. He had spent his entire life believing that a loud growl or the invocation of his alpha bloodline could shatter any obstacle. He was currently learning that brute muscle meant absolutely nothing against a meticulously audited ledger. Eldon adjusted his glasses, his voice a dry, rasping monotone that carried effortlessly to the highest vaulted ceilings. He read the statutes of the Grand Lycan Charter aloud, detailing precisely how the Red River Pack had violated the maritime transport clauses, through a century of extortion, forging border tariffs to bleed neutral merchants dry. Every word, every cited date, every mathematical correction was a rusted nail, driven into the coffin of Drake's sovereignty. The head counselor formally decreed the immediate revocation of the Red River Pack's regional trade license. The southern shipping routes, the lifeblood of their winter fuel and grain economy, were officially transferred to the Ironwood Dominion's jurisdiction. Furthermore, the penalty fines for the fraudulent transit fees were calculated and set at a sum so catastrophic it would drain Drake's treasury long before the spring thaw arrived. Drake stepped forward, his hands gripping the wooden railing of the defendant's stand so tightly that the ancient lacquer cracked beneath his knuckles. His chest expanded as he drew breath to project the commanding voice of an alpha king, desperate to argue his lineage, demand mercy for his starving people, and hurl threats at the council members who had once bowed to him. He never got the chance. Unmoved by a wolf's roar, the head counselor brought the heavy brass stamp down onto a fresh pool of hot crimson wax. The sharp crack of the seal, hitting the parchment, echoed like a gunshot through the chamber, cutting Drake off entirely mid-sentence. The council guards moved forward in perfect unison, the heavy iron butts of their polearms striking the stone floor to signal the absolute end of the session. Drake was dismissed from the hall, stripped of his roots, his wealth, and his authority. He had been utterly defeated, not by an army on a blood-soaked battlefield, but by the quiet, undeniable arithmetic of a woman he had once called nobody important. The winter wind howled against the reinforced glass of my newly expanded headquarters in the Ironwood Dominion, a bitter northern gale that would have frozen my old bones in the drafty corridors of the Red River Pack. Inside this room, however, the air was thick with the rich scent of cedarwood, roasting apples, and the crisp, clean smell of fresh parchment. I sat at a wide, polished mahogany desk, the steady heat from the stone hearth warming the side of my face as I flattened a large sheet of grid paper. Beside me, Matthew leaned over the new topographical maps, tracing the updated delivery routes with the blunt inks-stained end of his quill. He moved with the unhurried grace of a man whose power required no performance. Here, we were free from raised voices, demands for subservience, and arrogant posturing. We were simply calculating the exact volume of coal required to keep the northern settlements safe and fully operational through the deepest freeze of the decade. I reached into my leather satchel and pulled out a stack of fresh algorithmic journals. They were completely blank, their crisp white pages unburdened by the secrets, the encrypted failsafes, and the survival anxiety of my past life. I aligned them carefully, along the edge of the desk, adjusting their positions until the dark leather spines were perfectly parallel to the brass inkwell. The physical geometry of the workspace, the predictable, ordered lines of commerce and supply, brought a profound, settling peace to my chest. Matthew paused his work to watch my hands for a moment, his dark eyes holding a steady, quiet respect, before returning his attention to the cargo capacities of the winter fleet. He asked a quiet, precise question about the draft limits of the heavy steamships navigating the frozen canals under my new thermal vent system. I answered him with equal precision, my voice calm and steady, sliding a column of calculated figures across the smooth wood for his review. He nodded slowly, reading the numbers with the gravity they deserved, and signed his name at the bottom of the regional distribution contract without questioning my math. The black ink dried quickly in the warmth of the firelit room. Outside, the relentless snow was burying the old roads, blanketing the world in a silent, freezing white, but inside this fortress, We had enough grain, enough fuel, and enough structural integrity to outlast the longest night of the era. I looked down at the clean pages of my new journal, picking up my silver pen. The worst part of my old life had never been the grueling labor itself, nor the sheer exhaustion of carrying a pack's survival on my shoulders. It had been the silence that followed it, the absolute invisibility of my efforts, the assumption that my quietness meant I possessed no value. But here, bathed in the firelight beside a sovereign who understood the true weight of a carefully balanced ledger, I was no longer a shadow hiding behind a heavy velvet curtain. I was the architect of the North, and my hands, finally and forever, were perfectly steady.